Here are a couple of coin portraits now of Constantine and his wife Fausta. So in 312, he won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. He made Christianity legal the following year, called the First Great Church Council at Nicaea in 325, founded Constantinople, and at least in part financed the building of St. John Lateran and St. Peter's in Rome, the most important churches there still today. He did, however, put off baptism till he was near death on the theory that the sacrament wiped out all prior sin, and that the prudent thing to do then was wait to undergo it until one couldn't commit any more sins. And it's just as well, perhaps, that he arranged things this way, because his family life was not a good model for his fellow Christians. For one thing, he killed his wife. He did this because she accused Crispus, his son by his first wife, of attempting to seduce her, Fausta, in hopes of getting him disinherited in favor of her own sons by her first husband. Constantine did execute Crispus, but then he found out the truth and killed Fausta also. Donnie met him in paradise, however, so the deathbed baptism seems to have worked. This sarcophagus was found in the mausoleum of St. Helena, Constantine's mother, on the Via Casalina east of Rome, but it doesn't seem suitable for a saintly, grandmotherly type. Looks more to the taste of Attila and the Huns, or General Patton, maybe. Some think Constantine himself may have been buried in it, though there was nothing left of Constantine or whomever inside the thing when it was found. This is a close-up of it. The art of the age of Constantine is usually considered to be of poor quality, but this is carved out of a solid block of porphyry, or red marble, and it's certainly an impressive work of craftsmanship at least. This is the Porta Nigra, or Black Gate, which was probably begun in Constantine's day at Trier, now in Germany on the Mosel River. In the 4th century, Trier was one of the most impressive cities north of the Alps, and the capital, in effect, of Gaul and Britain at the time of Constantine's father, Constantius Chlorus. The wall around the city was 6 miles long, and the gate you see here is the most impressive one surviving in any Roman city wall. In his will, Constantine divided the empire he'd spent his life reuniting among his sons. Constantine II got Gaul and Britain along with Trier here. Constans got Italy, and Constantius got Constantinople in the east. Giving them names that must have been confusing even to himself, however, did not incline them to like each other. They quarreled constantly, as it were. Constantine II was killed trying to get Italy from Constans. Constans was then assassinated, and Constantius was killed making war on his cousin Julian, about whom we've heard already, who wound up briefly holding title to the whole messy empire again. Here's the modern bridge across the Mosel in Trier, which still rests on the original Roman foundations. Ausonius, the 4th century Latin poet, called Trier the Rome beyond the Alps, and it's claimed by the Germans that Constantine spent more time here than in Constantinople or Rome. Ausonius was sort of the Isaac Walton of his day. His most famous poem describes the 12 best fish to be found in the Mosel. Here's the amphitheater in Trier, the arena. Tradition says that the Christian Constantine threw pagans to the lions in this theater at Trier, but that can't be documented. Almost every city of any consequence in the empire had an arena like this, but every city of consequence had baths, and the baths here were the largest outside Italy. Although Trier was part of Gaul in the 4th century, it is now part of Germany, very little of which was controlled for any length of time by the Romans. It does, nevertheless, have more extensive Roman remains than any other city in what is now called Germany. This is the so-called Basilica of Trier, which has undergone extensive restoration since World War II. It's now one of the most impressive such buildings north of the Alps, and it is thought to have had a considerable influence, like the massively round-arched Porta Nigra, on the development of Romanesque architecture in the north. It was probably used as some kind of assembly hall or throne room, but as you see the interior here now, Jean Bonny at UC Berkeley referred to it as Constantine's Palace, though if that's true, it must have been a drafty and charmless place in which to live. It looks more like a warehouse than a palace, even in its restored state. It is now used as a Protestant church. Trier certainly is one of the most rewarding cities in Germany for those interested in history and architecture, and it doesn't get as much attention from tourists as it should. We'll hear more about it in the future, too, as the seat of one of the 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire. The cathedral which you see here has a Roman central core of the 4th century, the brick part in the center of this picture, an 11th century section at the west to the right, and a 12th century section at the east to the left in this picture. In addition to its association with the aforementioned emperors and others I've not mentioned, it is associated with several important figures in the history of the early church, too. Jerome says he first took Christianity seriously here. Athanasius visited it in his efforts to convert the Arian heretics among the barbarians of Germany, and St. Ambrose was born here. This is a mosaic portrait of St. Ambrose, conceivably, but not probably, made by someone who had seen him. He was one of the strongest characters of his day, though, and just doesn't look the part here. I imagine a lot of people who've met him in Paradise have told him he looks nothing like his picture. I think of him looking something more like Charlton Heston myself. He was the son of an important politician, and in 370, the Emperor Gratian, who was to become an ardent Christian under his influence, gave him the title Governor of Cisalpine Gaul, essentially the area between the Po and the Alps, with his headquarters in Milan. Though not a Christian, he became known as such a fine fellow that when the bishop of Milan died, the local clergy named Ambrose to succeed him. After some doubt, he took the job, was baptized, ordained, and made a bishop all in a week. The Church of San Ambrogio, named for St. Ambrose in his honor, was originally built in the 380s, but it was entirely rebuilt around 1100, and it is that rebuilding which we see now. You can see here that kind of scallop decoration that is derivative of the columnless arcade we first saw created accidentally in the gate to Diocletian's palace. It'll become a staple feature of what's called the Lombard Romanesque style. The campanile to the right was built in the 9th century when the original church was still standing. One of the most important events in the early history of the church occurred in Milan when St. Ambrose baptized St. Augustine on Easter Sunday 387, and the 2 future great doctors of the church are supposed to have then composed the Te Deum in celebration of the event. St. Augustine was born in North Africa and went to Rome to be educated. We know a lot about his scandalous early life because he wrote the first tell-all autobiography in the history of literature. It's sort of in the form of a confession of his pre-baptismal sins. For example, his Christian mother, Saint Monica, the patron saint of all mothers of troublesome children, wanted, knowing his irresponsible ways, to accompany him to Rome. He attempted to ditch her in Alexandria, but she persevered and finally made it to Rome too. I have some sympathy for Augustine in this. After all, not many teenage boys want their mothers going off to college with them. Anyway, he then got a job in Milan, where his mother again caught up with him and persuaded him to listen to the sermons of St. Ambrose, which perhaps helped him go so far as, in a famous passage, to ask the Lord, "O Lord, give me chastity, but not yet." Then one day he was discussing the New Testament with a friend, and he heard a voice say, "Tolle lege," pick it up and read it. So he opened the Bible randomly to the passage where Paul says, "Put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof." This struck him in such a way as to lead him to go to Ambrose for baptism, which event occurred, as I mentioned, Easter Sunday 387. The Te Deum, which Ambrose and Augustine are supposed to have written to commemorate the event, is one of the few examples of a hymn originally specific to the Ambrosian liturgy, which, as the name of course indicates, is attributed to St. Ambrose himself, to still have a place in the Gregorian liturgy. It is part of the Sunday Matin service and is also often used for special celebrations of one kind or another. The Church allows the liturgy attributed to St. Ambrose to be used only in Milan in honor of the saint himself. We'll hear the Te Deum now. Te Deum laudamus, Te Dominum confidimus, Te aeternum patrem. This is the interior of San Ambrogio now. At the left is the bronze serpent, said to be the one which Moses held up in the wilderness so that those who looked upon it would be cured of their snake bites. Here it is up closer. It's on the coat of arms of the city, and it was used by both the Sforza and Visconti families, and it's on the Alfa Romeos made in Milan. This is the east end of the church. The unspatialized ear will probably notice little difference between the styles of Ambrosian and Gregorian chant, and one would have to pay close attention at Mass to notice any difference in the manner of Ambrosian celebration. The Mozarabic liturgy, which is used only in the Cathedral of Toledo, is the only other non-Gregorian practice allowed by the Church, and we'll hear about it later. I should mention that many scholars now think the hymn, the Te Deum, was actually written by Saint Nicetas, a contemporary of Ambrose and Augustine. This is the Church of San Lorenzo in Milan, and you're hearing another example of Ambrosian plain song or chant now. The Church of San Lorenzo in Milan, which probably once was the palace chapel of the Christian Emperor Gratian, the friend of Ambrose, the fellow I mentioned earlier who gave Ambrose his job in Milan. I'm not going to follow the imperial succession through all of its twists and turns, but Gratian was acclaimed emperor in 367, 4 years after the death of Constantine's nephew Julian, and far from attempting to suppress Christianity, as Julian did, he was one of the first to attempt to really suppress pagan classical tradition, though Christianity wouldn't be proclaimed the only legal religion of the empire until, as we'll see, many years later in the reign of Theodosius I. Although this church was largely rebuilt around 1100, the original octagonal plan was preserved in much of the original masonry. At left is what was probably the mausoleum of Gratian, now the chapel of San Aquilino. San Lorenzo is a rare example of a church that was centrally planned in the full sense, with the altar in the middle. That's probably because, as a palace chapel, it was not expected that there would be a large congregation present. Much of the interior decoration here is modern, but most of the building itself is, as I said, still 4th century. St. Augustine eventually went back to become Bishop of Hippo, modern Annaba in Algeria, and write, in addition to his Confessions, the City of God, which is his major work on Christian theology. Despite, or maybe because of, his early worldliness, he became famous for advocating asceticism and a disregard for worldly goods. He's thought to have been influenced by Plato in this, and he is probably, in fact, the most famous Christian theologian to be more influenced by Plato than Aristotle. The influence of his asceticism was also a main inspiration to medieval Christian monasticism. However, he also held the view, in what is thought to be his mature theological outlook anyway, that no amount of asceticism, or worldly morality and virtue, good works in other words, would guarantee a Christian, let alone a pagan, paradise in the absence of God's grace. This is essentially the view of St. Paul, and it is the thing about both of them which Luther later emphasized, as we'll eventually see. After the death of his uncle Valens, who had been in charge of the East during the early part of his reign, Gratian named the general Theodosius to take over there, and he eventually, nominally, ruled over the whole empire. He is, in fact, the fellow we should really consider to be the last emperor of the whole Roman package, though at his death he divided it again into East and West between his sons, who are possibly the fellows we see represented with him on this silver plate now in the Madrid Archaeological Museum. One of the most memorable events of his reign occurred in 390, when he ordered the massacre of some 7,000 people in Thessalonica after the murder of his tax collectors there. He rescinded the order which had been issued in angry haste, but it was too late. He said he was sorry after the massacre, but that wasn't enough to satisfy St. Ambrose, who refused to let him attend Christian services until he removed all his royal regalia and begged for forgiveness. This he finally did. Imperator intra ecclesiam est, quoth Ambrose, non supra. The emperor is within the church, not above it. This is one of those conflicts between church and state which become focused in the personal conflict of two powerful individuals. It's a case like that of Henry II and Becket, or Henry VIII and Thomas More. The church and Ambrose won the first round here, but it wouldn't win them all. This is the Church of St. Paul outside the walls, sometimes called St. Paul without the walls, but that leads people to expect a really strange-looking building. It stands where Paul was buried, a mile south of the Porta San Sebastiano in the wall around Rome, and it was connected to the wall by a covered portico that ran the entire distance. It's the most impressive surviving piece of architecture of Theodosius's day, although it was extensively rebuilt after a fire caused by a fight between roof repairmen in the 19th century. H.V. Morton says that St. Paul outside the walls here is still the church where one gets the best idea of what an early Christian basilica was like. When it was originally finished, it was the largest basilica in Christendom. To give you an idea of how much the early Christian architects were influenced by secular Roman basilicas, this is an artist's idea of what the Basilica Ulpia, built by Trajan in the 2nd century A.D., looked like. You should also be reminded of the courtyard of Diocletian's palace at Split, which, as I said earlier, looks almost like a basilica of this sort, only without a roof. St. Paul's is, in fact, the earliest surviving Christian church to use the arched colonnade we first saw there. The earlier Christian churches in Rome, like St. John Lateran, St. Peter's, Saints John and Paul, and San Clemente, were built with their altars at the west end in the manner of pagan temples, and St. Paul's is also the first church, at least first important church in Western Europe, to reverse this and put the altar at the east where it will be in almost all medieval churches. Here you get a blurred vision of Theodosius in his court in Constantinople on the base of the obelisk he erected in the stadium or hippodrome there. Though, as I said, he nominally reunited the whole empire, he is criticized by some historians for adopting the dangerous practice of using barbarian mercenary troops to fight other barbarians in the maintenance of this empire. Theodosius himself was a strong enough character that he could pull this off, but it wasn't long, as we'll see, before some of these barbarians got the idea that since they were defending the empire, they might as well run it too. Although Gratian and others before Theodosius had begun to give non-Christians a hard time, Theodosius is usually given credit for establishing Christianity as not only legal, as Constantine had done, but in fact as the only legal religion. He also called the second of the great church councils at Constantinople in 381. This is a manuscript page now representing the Council of Constantinople with the emperor, the haloed fellow to the right. The Council of Nicaea had said that Jesus and the Father were of the same substance, but what about the Holy Spirit? The Council of Constantinople added a phrase to the Credo which said that one must also believe in the Holy Spirit qui ex patre procedit, which proceeds from the Father, proceeds being thought, I suppose, a vague enough term for anyone to interpret as he chose. In the 9th century, under the prodding of Charlemagne, the church in Rome would add the word filioque and the Son to this, creating what would come to be known as the filioque controversy. The rationale was that if Jesus and God the Father were of the same substance, what proceeded from one must proceed from the other. In the East, there was reluctance to add this word filioque and the Son to the Mass, partly just because the Eastern Greek-speaking bishops didn't like being dictated to by Rome. In 1054, Pope Leo IX, though, would excommunicate Michael Carularius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Roman and the so-called Eastern Orthodox Church, which would itself have various branches, parted company for good. This happened not just because of the filioque controversy, but because by 1054, as we'll see, East and West had grown farther and farther apart, each developing its own traditions, ceremonies, and practices, though theologically the churches have always been close. In 395, when Theodosius died, he divided the empire once again between his sons. Arcadius got the east, and we'll hear more about that next week, while Honorius got the west. Honorius looks good enough in this coin portrait, but he was worthless. Gibbon says he passed the slumber of his reign, an indifferent spectator to the ruin of the empire, and accuses him of being preeminent above his subjects, not only in power but in fear. His fear, although if he had been a better man in general this might have been called prudence, led him to move the imperial residence from Milan, which was difficult to defend, to Ravenna, a swamp-encircled port on the Adriatic. This is an ivory plaque with the barbarian mercenary general Stilicho on it. He and the other members of his Vandal tribe had been among those serving Honorius's father, Theodosius, The Vandals, and the meaning of our word Vandal, which is derived from the name of the tribe, gives you some idea of their reputation, were one of the most important groups to migrate into Europe at this time. They eventually crossed Europe entirely to occupy what came to be known as the land of the Vandals in southern Spain, Vandalusia, or Andalusia as we call it now, and many crossed over to North Africa as well. Honorius married the daughter of Stilicho, but Honorius, the emperor, was as indifferent to her as he was to the fate of the empire, and according to Gibbon, she died still a virgin without making Stilicho, as he had hoped, the grandfather of the next emperor. Theodosius had also hired Alaric and his Visigoths from Scandinavia. Stilicho remained loyal to Honorius, his son-in-law, but Alaric did not. In 401, Alaric invaded Italy and was defeated by Stilicho at Pollentia the following year. But you can see from this map that there was by this time a great wave of pink barbarians just ready to crash down on the empire. The Angles will wind up in Angleland, England, as we'll see, along with many Jutes and Saxons. Many of the latter will also settle in Saxony, of course. The Franks will settle in Frankland, that is France. The Thuringians in Thuringia, the Burgundians in Burgundy, the Alemanni in Germany, what the French call Allemagne to this day, the Lombards in Lombardy, the Huns in Hungary, and so on. In 403, Stilicho defeated a league of various barbarian tribes which was besieging the city of Florence under the leadership of Radagasius, and was rewarded by Honorius with a monument in the Forum in Rome. This is, I think, also the first event to be mentioned in connection with the growing city of Florence in history. Here's the surviving base of the monument, but you can see that two lines are chiseled out, and they are the very ones, say scholars, which paid respect to Stilicho. Honorius became more and more concerned about Stilicho's power, and finally in 408 ordered him assassinated, a thing generally acknowledged to be about as cowardly, dishonorable, and brainless as is to be found in the history of imperial biography. Alaric, who had been driven out of Italy in 402, now immediately returned to besiege Rome, which bought him off with 17 tons of gold and silver, 10,000 silken fur cloaks, and a ton of pepper. In 410, he and his greedy Visigoths came back again, however, and this time broke into the city, and it was sacked by a foreign army for the first time in 800 years. The things you see here make up what's called the Esquiline treasure, which is thought to have been buried about this time to keep it out of the hands of Alaric. Contains the world's earliest surviving jello mold, I've been told. There's little in the way of reliable information about the sacks surviving, but the general view is that it was not as much of a pillaging rampage as the later sacks by the Vandals, the Normans, or the army of Charles V in the 16th century, all of which we'll hear about eventually. Alaric and most in his army were at least Arian Christians, which might lead one to think they were more well-behaved than some barbarians, but the Normans and Charles V were Christians too. In any case, people seem to have regarded the event as a sort of once-in-a-millennium occurrence, kind of like an earthquake, and quickly went to work cleaning and rebuilding, and as we'll see, two of the most important churches in Rome, in fact, were built shortly after Alaric's sack of the city. As a footnote, I might just mention that Pope Innocent I was out of town at the time, not that his presence would likely have been a difference. Ironically, he was meeting with representatives of Honorius, trying to negotiate a treaty between him and Alaric. We'll be back in Rome in a few minutes, but first I want to tell you about the Council of Ephesus, which took place in 431. There's an old tradition to the effect that St. John brought the Virgin Mary to Ephesus after the crucifixion. And John himself is said to have been buried here, where you see the impressive ruins of a 6th century basilica erected on the orders of Justinian. According to tradition, this is the house in which Mary lived in Ephesus, and the date of the foundations, at least, is not inconsistent with this view, though the house itself is apparently medieval. It was at least in part because of the association of the Virgin Mary with Ephesus that the third of the great church councils, the main purpose of which was to consider the status of Mary, met here in 431. The council met in what is now called the Church of the Councils, but which is also called the Church of the Virgin Mary, and it is likely that it is in fact the first church to have been dedicated to her around 300 or so AD. It was decided at this council that Mary, while not entitled to be called a goddess herself, was nevertheless entitled to be called Mater Dei, the Mother of God. The reasoning was that if she was to be the mother of Jesus, and Jesus was of one substance with God the Father, as we've heard, then she must be Mater Dei as well. This is another view of the ruins of the Church of the Councils at Ephesus. There was a lot of controversy about this, and Nestorius, the Bishop of Constantinople, refused to accept this view, arguing commonsensically that Mary could only be the mother of Jesus insofar as he was a human being. Nestorius was deposed for this opposition after the council went against him. As I said, this church, at least locally, was already apparently being referred to as the Church of Mary, but the decision of the council was thought to put the official approval of the church at large on this and on the dedication of other churches to her. In the popular view, the upshot of the council was to recognize the sainthood of Mary. You'll remember that Ephesus had already long been associated with the worship of Artemis, called Diana by the Romans, and that Paul had run into trouble with her followers here. And the date now picked for the celebration of the Assumption, the reception into heaven of the Virgin Mary, was August 15th, the same day on which the celebration of the glory of Artemis had been held earlier. It may be that this date was chosen to make a clear statement that Christianity was taking over, but it may also have been thought that the use of this date would make the transition from the worship of the pagan goddess to the Christian saint easier. Remember, the church also chose to celebrate the birth of Jesus on the date associated with the birth of Mithras already. In a sense, then, the Church of the Councils is perhaps the first church dedicated to the Virgin Mary, but Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome here is often said to be the first church dedicated to her, and as it stands, it is at least the first begun in her honor after the Council of Ephesus met and put its stamp of approval, its imprimatur, on such dedications. It's also the oldest church dedicated to Mary to have a continuous history of use until the present day. As a matter of fact, the church we see now was preceded on the spot by a church referred to in the 4th century as St. Mary of the Snow, it having been built originally after Pope Liberius saw a vision in which the Virgin is said to have asked him to build a church where snow would be found on the Esquiline Hill the following morning. In any case, the church we see now, though, was begun in 432 and is one of the two important churches begun in Rome soon after the sack by Alaric. It has an 18th century facade, but the overall look of the interior is very much as it was in the 5th century. This is the interior now of Santa Maria Maggiore, and according to Sir Kenneth Clark, it is here that one gets the best idea of what one of the great Christian basilicas was like in antiquity. The floor was redone in the 12th century and the ceiling in the Renaissance, but the colonnades are original, as are most of the mosaics above them and at the east end. Despite the impressiveness of this church dedicated to the Virgin, though, the fashion for dedicating churches to her, which was eventually to lead to more being dedicated to her than to any other saint, did not catch on throughout Western Europe until later in the Middle Ages. Rome alone now has about 50 churches dedicated to the Virgin. Among the original 5th century mosaics is what is likely the earliest representation of the Annunciation in Christian art. When we get to San Vitale and San Apollinare in Classe next week in Ravenna, we'll see mosaics that are more famous than these, but the ones here at Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome are about a century earlier than those in Ravenna. In this mosaic, you can see Melchizedek offering bread and wine to Abraham as he does in Genesis. Although the event seems to be of little consequence in context, it is the kind of thing referred to by the church as a typology. This means that it is considered to be an Old Testament event which foreshadows something to come in the new or in the future of the church. In this case, the offering by the priest Melchizedek of bread and wine to Abraham is thought to foreshadow the use of bread and wine in the Eucharist. The other great mid-5th century church built in Rome is Santa Sabina on the Aventine Hill. As I've mentioned, H.V. Morton thinks St. Paul outside the walls gives you the best idea of what one of these early basilicas was like in its heyday, while Kenneth Clark prefers Santa Maria Maggiore. Georgina Masson, the author of Fodor's Guide to Rome, prefers Santa Sabina to the others, and certainly as far as location goes, it has something on them. St. Paul's is now in a kind of grungy working class part of the city, and Santa Maria Maggiore sits on a kind of traffic island. While the setting of Santa Sabina isn't quite as bucolic as this picture makes it look, it's a good deal more pleasant a place than the others have. We just saw what is considered to be the earliest surviving representation of the Annunciation at Santa Maria Maggiore, and one of the original wooden doors of Santa Sabina has what is certainly at least one of the very earliest representations surviving of the crucifixion. Here's the interior of Santa Sabina now. Unfortunately, while the church building is basically the same as it was in the 5th century, the mosaics which once decorated the interior here are almost all gone. The opus sectile, or inlaid marble decoration above the colonnade, does remain, however. And here you get a better view of it. In 423, Honorius died and was succeeded by his nephew Valentinian III. In 440, about the time these churches were being built, Attila and the Huns unsuccessfully besieged Constantinople, where another nephew of Honorius, Theodosius II, had luckily just finished building new city walls we'll eventually see there. Attila then moved west until he was finally defeated in 451 by an alliance of Romans, Gauls, and Goths under the leadership of Valentinian III's general Aetius, or Aetius as he was probably called by his friends, at Chalons in France. He then turned his temporarily defeated but largely intact army south toward Italy, correctly supposing that the barbarians who had made up such a large part of the Allied force at Chalons would not be anxious to go all the way to Italy to fight him again. Valentinian III was no more energetic than his uncle Honorius, and caring little what happened to the rest of Italy as long as he was safe in Ravenna, made no attempt to lead a defense. And in the absence of imperial support and without his allies, there was little Aetius could do either. Pope Leo the Great then took matters into his own hands, and with no army at all, went north to meet Attila near Mantua, apparently somewhere along the river Mincio, to try to talk him out of invading Italy. This when Attila was no sort of Christian, not even an Arian. What happened at their meeting is still not certain. Gibbon thinks he promised Attila the daughter of Valentinian III in marriage. This is not altogether unlikely because it had been under discussion for years, but the usual view is that it was the impression that Leo himself made that really turned Attila away to die of a burst blood vessel in his throat on the night of his wedding to another wife a year later in 453. In 454, Valentinian had Aetius assassinated for the same reason his uncle Honorius had had Stilicho assassinated. He feared and envied the power of the general who was the primary bulwark of his empire. A year later, Gaiseric and his Vandals crossed from North Africa to Ostia and marched on Rome. Leo again attempted to stop an army with no earthly help, but this time he was unsuccessful, though he did at least get some vague promises that there would not be an indiscriminate massacre and that church property would be respected. Thousands were taken as slaves, however, and almost everything of value that was portable. When Lanciani excavated the Forum in the 19th century, these melted bronze coins were found on the floor of the Basilica Aemilia, and it is possible that they survived from the sack of Gaiseric, though they are possibly relics of the sack by Alaric. Be that as it may, as I mentioned earlier, it was fear rather than rational prudence that led Honorius to avoid both Milan and Rome and hide out in Ravenna, which was, especially for impatient barbarians, difficult to attack behind its swamps. Ravenna, as a result of this imperial favor and that of Valentinian III, has as great a concentration of fine 5th and 6th century buildings as any city in Europe, and next time we'll begin with a visit to some of them.